Hello everyone, welcome to this talk on Spring Initializr and StatusPanada. So before we start, just asking the obvious or not obvious. Who in this room doesn't know what StatusPanada is? Nobody, perfect. All right. So you're at the good place. I'm not going to explain too much the user-facing things, but we are more going into a journey of what StatusPanada came to be and how it became the second favorite place on the internet for some people. Something you may not be aware of is that StatusPanada is actually composed of two projects as of quite recent. We've done that split this year officially. So we have a StatusPanada GitHub project where you can find our web UI and everything that's related to our opinions in terms of dependencies. So you'll find there the selected dependencies, whatever code that we change in projects based on the dependencies that you've selected, our opinions about what versions of Java needs to be available on the site, that kind of things. And of course, since the very beginning, behind StatusPanada there is a library called Initializr, Spring Initializr. And that's where you'll find the API to generate projects and customize how those projects are generated. And also some facilities such as web endpoints that allows you to expose an HTTP API to generate projects, actuator support to get metrics about how your projects are generated. And you can therefore use the library as a means to create your custom instance. So let's get started with a small demo. This is the slot right after lunch, so I'm responsible to keep you awake. We'll start with something very, very basic. Looking at the build, we only have one dependency, which is the base module that allows you to use the project generation API. And I have a very simple main method. As you can see here, no Spring involved yet. So just to show you the low-level API, where I'm creating a description for a project to generate with. Once you've used StatusPanada, you know about those options, right? That's some of the options you can find in the UI. I'm adding also a dependency for the sake of the demo. And then I'm calling generate project on the class. So if we look at this method now, there's basically two components. There's the project generator class, which is the entry point of project generation. You get back a callback with something called a context. We'll see in a minute what it does. And the generator, what it does is you give it a description of a project and what we call an asset generator interface, implementation rather. And it will do something. It will produce something. And we offer a default implementation of that interface that will gather the components that can contribute something to the project and invoke them in an explicit fashion. So I also have like a little trick here, as you can see, where I'm using the current time as a way to name the directory where the project is located. So if I run this, I basically have a project now, which is in this directory. And if we look at it, there's nothing, right? Because there's nothing on the class path, just the generation API. So there's no opinion at this point. So we can have a very simple, basic contributor, what we call contributor. And to show you how that works, I'm just going to implement the very high-level API you can use in this generation API, which is called project contributor. And project contributor, you give it a path, and the path is a root directory of the project. It's the root directory of the project, right? And from there, you can do pretty much anything you like. So in this very basic example, I'm just going to create a simple file called hello.txt, and I'm just going to write test in it. So how do you make sure that the generator knows about your contributor? Going baby steps here. So I'm going to simply register it explicitly in the context. Simple contributor.class. There we go. So now this line is basically whenever a new project is requested, the context will be augmented with this bean. And because this is a project contributor and we are using the default implementation, that's going simply to invoke it, and back to our project, we now have our file. Very basic. Not very interesting either. The project actually offers way more. And I want to show you quickly something related to build support. So we have an abstraction for builds, as you will see in a minute, both Maven builds and Gradle build. So this is also a very basic contributor, except this one, what it does, it generates a POM file, right? And it generates a POM file in two steps. One, there is a model of the build. As you can see, that's the method below, where we use the project description to feed a model. So we basically augment, we create a model, and we set characteristic in this model. So that's step one. And step two, we also have writer implementations for those models. So both for Gradle, the Kotlin DSL and the Groovy DSL, and Maven for the pom.xml file. And we just pass the model to it, and it will generate the file for us. So this is code you don't have to write, and based on the model, you pretty much get this as a result. As we will see later, there's way more abstraction. There's also abstraction to generate code automatically with support for Groovy, Kotlin, and Java, of course. And we also have like some implementations of project contribution for a well-known use case. But before we do that, I'd like to get back a bit to the history of the project, how it came to be, how we discovered and implemented features we were not aware when we started this small project. So if we start with the very beginning, the first commit, it was in March 2013, and Dave Sayer actually initiated that project based on something called Initializr.com. I don't know if you know about this. If you go to Initializr.com, spelled like this, you'll end up into some web UI that allows you to generate an HTML5 template application. So you select the kind of web application you want to use, you click next, and you get a zip with some client-side assets. So we said, okay, Initializr, let's create Spring Initializr based on that system. And the fact that it was written like this was quite of a problem. There's namely Craig Walls, who wrote Spring in Action, who had a section about Spring Initializr in his book. And whenever he was pushing new updates of his book, the editor came back saying, you need to fix that typo. And he kept telling him that it wasn't a typo, it was the name of the project. I should also say that when we designed those slides, we actually made a typo in the name. So right, first commit is March 2013, looks like this. Don't judge. It was 6 years ago, right? Don't judge. So we started with a single Groovy script. Back in the day, Spring Boot did not exist yet. We were like working on Spring, what was called Spring Bootstrap at the time, as you can see in the first grab annotation over there. So Spring Boot as a concept, I assume, did not exist yet. And we wanted to prove it was possible to write a complete application with the Spring CLI, right, as a proof of concept of the feature we are currently building. And so we started with this. You can see here there's a single endpoint with some styles that are hard-coded and some types, which is the project types you want to build. And there is a mustache template or time leaf template, I can't remember now. That's basically this web UI. Oh, you're there, Deb. Hello. Okay, I should stop saying bad things about you then? Sorry. It was all right so far? Okay. So this is the first web UI, wonderful web UI, as we can all see, with only a few options there. But this is what we had. So March 2013, there was like a single spring.cfapp.io domain that we used. It wasn't started Spring.io yet. So we used a single Groovy script, hard-coded dependencies. That part is maybe something we could improve. And as I explained, we were using the Spring CLI as a proof of concept. So it was a single repo with a single script, a template, and you would run the application by doing Spring run app.groovy, and you would have Spring Initializr showing up. A bit after that, I don't remember now, but we basically secured start.spring.io. So we decided to go with that name, and that's the name we all know today. So this is something right that we did right from the start. So we have something that's working. It's a project, so let's make a release. Actually, we didn't do that, and I want to get back a bit as why we've decided to do it that way. We made releases eventually, but the service that you know and that you use is running on snapshots since the first day. So start.spring.io never ran on a release. It always ran on snapshot. And it wasn't such a problem the first few years, but as it became really popular, we kept having this feedback either on Twitter or GitHub issues or whatever. Start.spring.io is down. I cannot work anymore. We're just like deploying an increment, a new feature, and there was like a 5 seconds gap where the route became unavailable, sorry. And people were using it so often that it was a problem. So we decided to switch to a blue-green deployment with a very classic way of doing things as we know it today, but back then that was quite something. So code and commit. Whenever we commit, there is a CI build running. We have like a very extensive suite of tests. Even more so this year, where we started now to, for each entry, get back to Maven Central or the repository, analyze the dependency tree to make sure it was consistent with what we expected to do. For certain combinations, actually generate a project and running a build with every build system we support. So we do that at each commit. And once that's done, the usual CF push, and it does so in a blue-green fashion. So it will deploy on blue if green is running. Once blue declares healthy, the router would switch from green to blue, and green can be used again for the next time someone makes a change to the library or the service. That part usually doesn't happen, but yeah, better safe than sorry, I guess. So what's the typical use case? And what we had very early on, something you know and you use today, but there's way more to it now. As a developer, you're in the browser, you want to generate a new project, right? So you contact start.spring.io, and you get a form in return. You get HTML. Once you have that, as a developer, you fill in the form with whatever you need, and you get back a zip file. The problem with this is it's a development-related task, right? And we don't want you to have to go to an IDE to do that. We want you to make sure you keep your browser for your Stack Overflow tabs and do not use an extra tab for start.spring.io. So we meant to provide as many options as possible, because every developer is different, right? Some of you prefer to do it in the IDE, some of you prefer to do it on the command line, or you may want to enjoy the web UI, or maybe a combination of both. So we wanted to make sure you had those options. But the problem is, you can't really serve HTML to a command line client, right? You can't really give an IDE HTML content, even though that happened at some point. So what we've decided to do is we've decided to have two options for them. Oh boy, That's why I don't like animations. One more, there you go. We've decided to split into two. So there's the web use case, but there's also a way to get a standard JSON description of what the service can do. And remote clients, what they do is they issue a request to an instance of Spring Initializr. StatusPanada is one of them, but you could have your own. And based on that document, they know the options that are available, and they can present that to the user. So we wanted to avoid the browser use case, so that's what we did a year after, pretty much at the same time as Spring Boot 1.0 in GA, I believe, which is an extra command on the Spring CLI. So you've seen Spring Run, which allows you to run the app. But you can also download the Spring CLI in your environment, and you can get started with Spring Init. This was comfortable for us because we were the designer of that new client, so you could provide a dedicated help page. We could provide you auto-completion. We could basically provide you anything you need to understand how to use the service. So this is one command to create a new project with the Spring Boot Web Starter, and you want to say you prefer to use the Gradle build. So this will contact StatusPanada.io, get the zip, unzip that for you, and you'll have the project in your directory and you're good to go. So we have control over this. And at the same time, we were discussing how we could lower the requirements to get started with a new project. So we already had added the Maven or Gradle wrapper so that you don't have to install a build tool if you don't have one. And what we aimed for was that the only thing you need to have on your development machine was the JDK. That was really the end goal. This is not really compliant with this goal, right? Because you need to install the Spring CLI in order to use that client. So it was good, but it was not really what we wanted. And so we discussed how we can reuse tools that you already have on your machine, such as curl or HTTP-PY, so basic tools to access HTTP resources. But then the problem is, we don't really know how to teach you how to use that stuff, right? Because we can't really have an help page in curl that says how you can use StatusPanada.io. We can't do that in HTTP either. And then I remember very, very precisely a discussion I had with Phil Webb, who made those slides, by the way, kudos to him. If I had made those slides, it wouldn't be that fun, I'm sure. And that discussion was, he went along with this. What if when you actually invoke the service, it would return you a text file with how you can use it? And I found that really excellent. So that's what we decided to do. And a bit after, we added support for curl and HTTP-PY. So you can use that today if you're not aware of it. If you curl StatusPanada.io, you'll get a text file with the attributes that you can use, the dependencies that are available, and at the end, you'll get a few samples. So you get a few examples of how you can invoke the service. IDE support also. I told you about this metadata file that we described. So we worked with IDE vendor so that they start using that and provide a dedicated UI. So you have that in STS and IntelliJ as of March 2015. A year after that, we had support for NetBeans. It was a contribution from the community. More recently, VS Code joined the fun. So if you're using VS Code, you also have like a plugin for that. There is no plugin for Emacs. There's no plugin for VI I'm aware of. But if you're using any of those things, you probably know how to write a plugin for it. Meanwhile, not so much love for the web UI, right? We've been spending a lot of time creating those new use cases, creating the metadata file. The team at the time, and when I mean the team, I mean me, were not at all skilled to do anything web-related. It's still a complete mystery to me. So whenever they had something web UI related, I was bugging someone else. So suffice to say, we didn't have really a lot of resources and not a lot of time. And Yet we had a very clear vision of what we wanted to do. What we wanted to do is to give you a very, very easy getting started experience, right? We didn't want you to have to fill in a wizard with multiple steps. We didn't want you to have complex options to choose from. And at some point, we also get some pushback from the community because they were asking for options. Can you please add an option for this? Can you please add an option for that? Or why don't you change the UI so that it has more steps so that we can select more options? That was not consistent with our vision, so we had to decline those features. But we really believe that making it easy for the developer was the way to go. So a bit of history about the web UI. You've seen already that one. The first, I actually did the checkout of all those commits and ran the instance again locally to take screenshots. So that was quite fun to see that stuff actually works with the latest Spring Boot release. Just had to change the grab annotation, of course, because Spring Bootstrap 0.5, I'm not even sure we still have that. Then 2 years later, we went with V2. And if you look at the difference, well, there's obviously certain difference, but one thing I would like you to focus on is the list of dependencies. So you only see 5 of them in this screenshot because that was the first commit. But once the project evolved and Spring Boot also evolved quite a lot, we had more and more starters. So it's more and more checkboxes. So we ended up with what we called internally the sea of checkboxes. And it was a bit overwhelming. So we've decided to move that to a new UI where you basically have a searcher, that searcher on the right there. With a few keystrokes, you can get a list of dependencies that are tailored to what you're looking for and basically select them. So we went along with this V2 for quite some time. Who know about that V2 version? All right, that's 20%. V3 came along almost 4 years later, so that's quite a gap. So as I will explain, the difference is that more recently we had more bodies joining the team. We also had a UI UX expert joining us who designed that new web client. We also had a PM for a rotation for 3 months. He helped us basically focus on features. And we've done something very, let's say, challenging or provocative in this version. You may have heard of it. If we've removed the list of dependencies altogether. So if you look at V3 as it is there, the one we shipped, you couldn't see the list of versions. And we did that on purpose. We did that on purpose because we wanted to understand why users need to see that list and why they couldn't search, why they couldn't use the searcher to get dependencies. And so we had interesting feedback, users giving us the feedback that they go there to know what's supported, or they go there to see what's blessed by the Spring team. And none of that is actually the case. So we really focus on this site, dependencies that you can use to get started, right? It's not all the dependencies that we support. So if there is a project interesting out there, if it's not on StatusPanada.io, that doesn't mean we don't like it. It just means that at that point, either we don't know about it, or we know about it and we consider it's not a getting started use case. It's not something that you choose when you get started with a new project. Suffice to say, 2 weeks later, we had a V301, where there is this see all link over there that gives you a modal pop-ups sort of with the list of dependencies. And we also add, you can see that on the right, there was a survey. So that's the PM work I was talking about, basically getting feedback from you to better understand how you're using the service. 3.1 was a major rewrite on the client. As you can see, the link disappeared. And now you can either search or see the list of dependencies. That's the picture you see on the bottom. A month later, a new feature to help you explore the project. So that's a direct byproduct of the survey. So that's one of the things that the users told us using that server is that they actually go on the site, not to generate a new project, but to look at something. And so the way they do that, the way they used to do that, is to get the zip and zip, look at the file, throw away what they've done. Whereas all they want to do, all they want to know is, for instance, what Spring Cloud version should I use with what Spring Boot version? Because I have an older Spring Boot version, I'm upgrading, I don't know what Spring Cloud version I should use. And this is a very effective way for you to get that information. So Damien was on fire, our UI and UX expert. As you can see, we had a bunch of increments this year. So 3.3 was released last month, I should say, which annoyed me because I had to redo my slide 3 times. So I made sure to ask him, are you sure now you're not going to push anything else? And he said no. Then I redid my slide and I think he pushed something again. But it had no UI change, so that was good. So this one, what it does, it provides you an extra action in the bottom, which is the share action. And that's also feedback from the community, where they want to make sure that if they write a tutorial or a blog post, they want to make sure that users following the blog post or the tutorial end up in the right state. So what they can do, and you can do too, is change anything in the UI, select dependencies, click on that share button, and you'll get a permalink. If you use that again, you'll end up in the same state. And of course, because we are developers, we need to have a dark mode. So we have that now. That's interesting because I meant to do something like this, like in this presentation when I decided a few months ago to do that. I meant to show you the old client and the new client as a way to see the evolution, but someone beat me to it. So since he was first, I thought credit was due for the idea. So I want to spend a bit of time now on iterations, and what I mean by that is the story of the project more from a contributions perspective. So this is the commit history for the library. You can see that there's been some spike in the project, which revealed some interesting activity. So in the mid of 2014, what we've decided to do is to get away from this Unix script and move that to a Groovy library, so a proper Groovy module with a build. And the reason why we did this is because we felt that testing using the Spring CLI was quite challenging, especially with the test coverage that we wanted to, right? Remember at the time we were doing CI/CD already. So we wanted to make sure that whatever we shipped would not break users. So we've decided to migrate to a proper Groovy module. Then a bit later, 1 year later, all that activity around 2016 is about splitting that single module into a more modular approach, where we have a generation API that doesn't know anything about web. There is a web-specific module that provides the HTTP API, and there's an actuator module that provides metrics. It's also, I think, pretty much at that time we had 0.1 release, so the first release of the project. This huge spike is the migration to Java, where we basically rewrote everything. Well, actually, Dave used sed and whatever to add semicolons and stuff like that. It was a lot of fun. But we did that to align basically the project with other projects in the Spring portfolio that are written, as you know, in Java. We wanted to push even more the use case of a third party consuming this library to create their own instance. It became something that was asked more and more. So the idea of basically harmonizing and using Java was what we decided to do. Then a couple of things happened in the recent past. So for the most part, up to 2018, it was mostly a side project with not a lot of resources allocated to it. We're very passionate about it and basically doing what we could to improve it. But in 2018, we've decided that the whole Spring Boot team will join us and work on the project. So that's where we've decided to rewrite the project generation API. So you've seen the end result, right? What I just showed you in the demo. But initially, it wasn't like that at all. Initially, it was like templates with if and else conditions you had to patch. So the build file, for instance, for Maven was a single template with if then else for every languages we were supporting. So suffice to say, it was not really readable and quite a nightmare to maintain. So we had the idea for quite some time to actually remove all that and use a proper API for it, but didn't really have the resource. So in 2018, we started working on a Spike, a new API, so we prototyped on it. There is a bunch of things that happened in the project since then. And that Spike early this year is really the result of that Spike, where we merged that API in the mainline, and then we started iterating on it. Then we had the new UI effort, the PM joining us to drive a bit more the use case, etc. There's one more Spike at the end you can all relate to, I'm sure. If you ever had any sort of deadlines, or a talk at SpringOne, which we call the poop Spike. Actually, it's funny because I think it's funny. I redid that slide twice as well because there's two spikes, and initially the slides were with the first spike. Then I thought, okay, I'm done now, all good. I can give this talk and everything is fine. And then the closer we are on the talk, the closer I realize I'm not. And so the second spike is very recent. It's like last week. And we also had a release, by the way, for those who are using the project. So we had 0.8 released Monday. And this is also the first release that's hitting Maven Central. So if you're using that stuff, you can consume it without adding the repo.spring.io repository. All right, so as I told you, it's the slot after lunch, so I'm responsible to keep you awake. So a bit of quiz and questions. And first, the questions I'm sure nobody is able to answer because, of course, it hasn't been at all covered at the keynote. Who wasn't at the keynote yesterday? Ah, interesting. So there's a few people actually. So those who have been at the keynote and were actually paying attention, please do not reply. So the question is, how many projects do you think would generate a year? So you go to StatusPanada.io, or you are using your IDE, using the command line, it doesn't matter. You get and use it. Who thinks 10,000 a year? Nobody. Safe, I like it. Who think 100,000 a year? I have two. Okay, so there's three options, so I'm guessing I'm not going to ask you. It's more than 1 million, but for those who were at the keynote, it's actually more than 1 million a year, a month. So it's really a lot of projects. And I wanted to give you a bit of background about this. First of all, we are perfectly aware that it's not like 1 million apps going to production every month, right? We know there is a lot of prototyping. There's a lot of poking around and looking at things. But we're also very cautious about abuse of the service, making sure that a single IP does not generate too much projects. We also look at demographics. So this is not like, one IP generating 100,000 projects. So speaking about demographics, top countries, top 3 countries. Let's start with the third one. If you have an idea who is third, just shout the country name. US. I have US third. Poland. Poland third, okay. Anybody else? Didn't get that. Germany third, okay. None of those. India, well done. So second, China. US, Japan. It's the US. So first, well done. Yeah, it's China. So a bit less obvious, I should say. The big players like China and US could definitely saw them coming, I hope. What about the usage of the service, right? So web is our web UI, of course. CLI is anything on the command line, so Spring in it. HTTP PI, curl. There's also a bunch of third-party command line interfaces that have been built that we know, that we are aware of because they let us know, so we track the usage of that. And the IDE, reminder, it's basically any Java-based IDE you could think of, I think. STS, IntelliJ IDE, NetBeans, and VS Code. So if you think that web is first, raise your hand. Okay, so that's a good half of the room. CLI. I have two in the back. IDE. Yeah, it's interesting. So if I, roughly speaking, given the size of the room, I should say web is almost 50%, CLI is less than 1%, and IDE is the rest. This is surprising, I know. It's very surprising. I couldn't believe it myself when I saw it. So this is for the last year, by the way, so it's statistics for the last year. Massive usage of the IDE. But there is a trick to it, is China actually is so much usage on the side that if we remove China from the equation, you get a different result. So this is the usage if you exclude China access, where you get 50-50%, more or less. Web is actually 1% higher than the IDE. Right, okay. So I guess I don't have much time, right? How much time do I have? Like 2 minutes? Oh, okay, I started at 2. That's okay, still have time then. So what I want to do now is go back to the API and do a few more demos. But before I do that, I want to show you exactly how that project generation works. So project generation starts with a description of the project, right? Think it as the form that you fill in the IDE. You have a bunch of options, you select things, then you send that to the server. It's the description of the project you want to generate. That project description is going to be passed to a project generator implementation. And that project generator, what it will do, and that's the context you saw in the first demo, it is going to create an application context for the duration of that project generation. So every time we generate a project, there is a dedicated application context that's created, right? And in that context, what we do is we look for contributors. We look for components that can modify the model, components that can contribute to the structure. So anything that can do anything for a project. And based on the description, based on the choices that you've made, we will be able to isolate the ones that actually have to do something up front. So the ones that we don't need will go away. So you can think that as, let's say in the project description you've mentioned you want to use Maven, right? So if we have a bunch of contributions that are Gradle related, they will go away automatically. And once we have the contributions that we need, we will basically iterate on them and generate the project structure. But this is really open. It's not like, the template you had to patch yourself or the methods you had to override. It's you basically designing those components and add them to the class path. And you get a project. All right. So let's do a bit more. I'm going to fast forward a bit, where I'm in the same situation as before. except that I'm going to show you the mechanism where you can register those components. So if I run that simple main again, I'm getting the same content, right? I'm going my hello file and my pom file. And if I go back here, remember I was like adding stuff to the context here, it's gone. But there's a new class. That's basically the way you should register such component. So if you worked on auto configuration before, you know about this. It's the same mechanism. You declare a configuration that we call project generation configuration, and that configuration will be processed in that specific application context I was referring to for the project. And we scan, so the project generator scans those components automatically by looking at the Spring Factories file. So you see that there is a reference to that class, and if you have a jar in anywhere where you have those components and that registration, you just drop that jar on the class path, and those contributions can effectively be invoked. All right, so let's try to make that a bit more practical by showing you an example where it doesn't work at the moment. So if I go back to my test, well, I run really. Let's say I change the build system. Say I want to use the Gradle build system instead, and I run. So I'm basically expressing a different condition for the project. If I go there, I still have my pom file, right? That's not very interesting. So a way, was mentioning it on the slide, there's a way to flag conditions that would automatically discard contributors that do not need to do anything. So let's see that in action. So there's a conditions that the API provides, that the library provides, and you can also, as always, create your own. So there is a conditional on build system here, where I'm going to say, I want to run only if the project is actually interested by the Maven build system. So if I run again, I only have my test file here. The pom is gone. And the pom is gone simply because the bean is not created, right? The condition is matched. We can see it doesn't match the Maven build system. It goes away. Fast forward again. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add the conditions that run on StatusPanada. So that's not the pom file I meant to show you. This is the one. So initially, I only had the generator API, right? Now there's an extra dependency, and that extra dependency is gathering all the opinions that we have about a JVM-based project using Spring. So this is in that project you'll find something that creates the main class, something that creates the test class, something that creates an empty application properties, the git ignore. If you've used recently the service, you may be aware that now we generate an help.md file. So based on the dependencies that you select, you get a markdown file with some links and extra help to help you get started, basically. So all that is in a separate module. And as you've seen in the first demo, that module wasn't there. And it's actually completely optional. So you could reuse the infrastructure and completely ignore our conventions, or you could embrace our conventions and add more to it. So if I run the project again, ooh, what happened? I didn't expect that. Oh, I did. That's what happens when you change code and you don't rerun your demo. Right. So this must be this one. It's complaining about having two beans of the same type. So I meant to remove that later, but let's do it now. Yes, okay. So if we go back to the new project structure now, you can find the POM file, the Spring Boot plugin, and the parent and whatever. You still find extra dependency, right? The extra dependency that I set in the run project. You have a git ignore, as I was mentioning, the Maven wrapper, and you have the structure that you're used to. Okay. So the reason why it didn't work is because this component completely overlooked that when I implemented the feature. That component has the same bean name as the one that comes from the Spring conventions, right? So you have two bean with the same name, and it's actually one is overriding the other, and we don't want that. So we throw an exception now. And anyway, it's a good thing, because I don't want to have my silly Maven writer that does only a few things, whereas the one that's coming from the Spring conventions is much more powerful. So anyway, I meant to remove this and show you something else, show you how you can customize the build. So I'm going to add a build customizer instead for the build. Let's call that example version build customizer. And this is a callback that I can implement where I'm being given the model of the build, and I have a chance to mutate it. I have a chance to customize it. And there's a bunch of things you can do, right? You can add plugins, you can add dependencies yourself, you can add properties, you can configure plugins and executions. But in this case, let's say I'm going to add a simple version. And I'm not putting any condition, and I'm putting that on build, which is the main abstraction. So if I run that again, I have a new project. But the difference is now I have this property being added, right? So this is really a powerful way for you to, if you want to augment what StatusPanada does with your own conventions, you can write code like this, and it will simply augment the model, and the rest will follow, and it will write the project as before. Or you could remove the Spring dependency altogether and start from scratch. Right? You have nothing, you just have the low-level API, and you experiment with the low-level API. Yeah, there's a question in the back. Everything that you see is on GitHub. You mean this project? This demo? Yes, so this demo is indeed on GitHub, and the last slide has a link to the GitHub project. Yes? So the question is, if we have like a multi-module project, can I customize the parent or the intermediate POM? It's really, you have one model per POM, basically. So if you decide in your own infrastructure you want to have not a single module like StatusPanada does, but a multi-module project, you can just build it that way. So you could have a build model for the parent and a build model for the child, and you could simply customize one or the other, and it will basically work, yes. But you'll have to write some code, so there is no out-of-the-box support for multi-module structure yet. Okay, all that is very good, but I'm still like running projects in my IDE, which is not very interesting. I want to, yes, let's do that way. So the last commit I have is actually an extra service. So let's have a look to it. So the extra service has a dependency on the module we've been working on. So remember, it takes the Spring conventions plus one customization. There is one that generates a test file. I forgot the name now, but there's test in it. And there's another customization that adds a property to the build named example.version, right? So I have the Spring conventions and my own conventions. So that's the module on the top. This project also has two extra dependencies, one to make sure there's a web server actually starting, and the other one is the HTTP endpoint that the Initializr project provides. So Initializr Web is this extra module where you'll find the metadata system and the HTTP endpoint. If we look at the app itself, there we go. It's not very interesting. Initializr Web will also provide auto-configuration for the infrastructure so that you don't have to worry about it. And there's a basic metadata description for my custom service. So this new project is actually a custom instance. So you can see that I'm declaring a single dependency called web. There's also a bunch of project types, and I didn't add WAR packaging because, you should do jar packaging anyway. 2 Java versions, the 3 languages that we support. And here, just for the sake of the demo, I'm actually customizing the group ID that the project use. You know that if you go to StatusPanada.io, it always starts with com.example. And this change basically changes to use all.acme instead. All right, so let me start this. So this is really the code I've been working on, Initializr Web and Spring Boot Starter Web and a piece of metadata, and that's it. So I have the application running on my machine at the usual location. So I could do HTTP localhost 8080. And I get that page I was talking about earlier, right? With the project you can generate, you can see those 2 projects from the metadata file. You could see all.acme here being set as the default, and the list of dependencies, right? So I can now curl this instance, that's the only thing I need, and I can start creating projects. And it will work the same way as on StatusPanada.io. But I can also use the IDE, right? Because of the metadata file description I was mentioning, that offer standard support for it. So let's use localhost 8080 instead of the default here. Then I get my all.acme that I changed. I can see that the WAR packaging is gone. So basically the changes that I've applied has been automatically taken into account in the IDE. And I also have like the list of dependencies, only 1 in this case. So I'm basically getting started the same way as I would do on StatusPanada.io. And I get my new project with my hello file and my pump file with my changes, right? So this is really what it takes to get a custom instance off the ground. As you've seen, there is no web UI, so maybe something to mention is if I go to localhost 8080, you will not see the shiny web UI. As you know, you'll get the raw metadata file because there is no web UI, right? So the intent is the intent is to work with the IDE is the question. It depends on what you want to do with your custom instance, right? If you want the custom instance to be consumed on the web, you can reuse the web UI that we have, right? It's open source, so you can do it if you want. But we would recommend actually investing some time into creating a web UI on your own. That's what we've done for StatusPanada.io. We've put some of our opinions. So there's a banner with some link to guides and stuff like that. You would have to remove all of this. If you're prepared to do this and continue maintaining this web UI, all the power to you. Or you can use anything, basically. You can use a command line, you can use the IDE support, you can use custom clients even. So if someone has created a custom clients for StatusPanada.io, it will work on your custom instance.
But the changes that you've shown could be sufficient by themselves.
Yes, so the changes that I've shown is sufficient to use in the IDE on the command line with custom clients, because the idea is that you reuse basically the concept we've defined. You customize the way I've expressed with the couple of examples that I've showcased, and that infrastructure will start up and provide a standard metadata file that clients understand. So you won't have to do anything else, indeed. Oh, no thanks. All right, so that's all I have. I still have a bit of time for questions. If you want to try out the demo today, you can go there. As usual, you'll have one commit per demo, so you'll see each steps individually, and every time the commit message basically explains in a bit more detail what that does concretely. And the last commit, so if you check out master, you'll get the state I was showcasing last with the custom instance. You can run yourself and you can play with that. Any more questions? Yes. Yeah, okay. So your question is about that YAML file. What is? Right, okay. Totally, yes. So yes, so the question is, it's a library. You could put that in a Spring Boot app with your conventions, make that executable, and anybody could run it. The answer is yes. That's what StatusPanada does. So the application I was showcasing, I mean, I run it in my IDE, but it's a Spring Boot app, so you get all the benefits of a Spring Boot app. You can package it on the command line, just ship the jar somewhere and run it. And just as a wrap up about what we've seen today. We started with only a single module, which is the initializer generator. That stuff doesn't use Spring Boot, right? Just a bunch of APIs that allows you to write code, write a build, write text resources, write anything. This module also provides the abstraction, the contract that you have to implement to be able to customize the project. Once you have that low-level contract, you can start implementing what we call your own conventions. So for instance, if we generate a project with Maven, I would like to write a POM file. That's a convention for the project. And I want to write it in a certain way. That's the low-level module that you have. The second module that the project offers is the Spring conventions. And it's totally optional. You don't have to use it. If you bring that on the class path, the generation API will recognize it, and it will invoke it. So it will generate the POM file, generate a main class, generate a test class, generate a git ignore, etc., etc. If you want to create your instance on top of what we do, this is the recommended setup. You add our conventions, and then you bring a few extra customizers on top. Or you start from scratch. It's really up to you. Then there's two extra modules, one that I showcased and one that I didn't. Initializr Web is basically providing Spring Boot support and is providing the HTTP API. So the minute you put that jar in a Spring Boot application and you have a web starter, the HTTP API will show up automatically. And finally, the last thing that I didn't really take enough time to showcase now, I realize, is this application.yaml file I was showing with the customization with the org.acme and the dependencies and the types, etc. So everything that you do to declare the actual types that you want to provide in your own instance, you can do that via that configuration file. Remember at the very beginning, we had a Groovy script with 5 styles hard-coded and 2 types hard-coded. This concept still exists today, so that's the same concept, except you don't hard-code them in a Groovy file, you configure them in the configuration file. So because I only added a web dependency, a single dependency basically, this is the only choice that shows up in the IDE, and it's the only choice that shows up in the text file that curl or HTTP generates. But if you upgrade that YAML file with extra dependencies, you restart the app and they will show up. Yes? Yes. Yes, so the question is the library stabilized now because we forked it 6 months ago and you've changed a lot of things? Thank you for trying first. Yes, so we've changed a lot of things. That's a very good question. So the library is in a state, is in a pre-1.0 state, so it's 0.8 at the moment. We have plans for 0.9. We've shipped that to Maven Central for the first time, and we still intend to iterate on things that are not right. So the metadata module, for instance, wasn't really touched, and we really need to work on that. So there will be backward incompatible change there. But really the plan now, we've been working with this new generation API. What we want to do is really to make sure that, maybe do small changes here and there, because we will see some things that can improve in a non-backward incompatible manner. But it's not the plan like you had 0.3 that was groovy and 0.4 that was Java, and the API completely changed. We're not there anymore. So this version is really the first where I'm confident that the low-level API will stay in a backward compatible state. So the question is, if you have a project with a large number of resources, like a large number of files, do you go the code generation route, or do you go to a different route? I don't really have an opinion about that, except that for our own purposes, really the intent is not scaffolding, and the intent is not to generate a project with, for instance, a samples in it. Because the first thing that will happen is you as a new user, right, for the technology, you'll generate the project, oh, there's a sample entity there, and there's a test that showcases how I can use it. It's wonderful, I like it. And 2 weeks later, you need to bootstrap a new project with that tech, and you know how to use it, and you're really annoyed because you have to remove all those assets, right? And that's not the user experience that we want. The user experience that we want is to get out of the way as soon as possible, just give you the basics to help you get started. So we have no plan. The code generation API that we have at the moment is very simple, and we intend to keep it that way. So if you have very complex needs, there is probably other tools. We also have the constraint that we need to support 3 languages with pretty much the same model, right? Which is quite of a challenge. So we don't want to make that more complex than it needs to be. We already had some users asking, oh, can you do this, can you do that? And usually we say, okay, we don't have that need for the moment, maybe you should investigate something else. But the good news is, with the project contributor interface, you'll basically get a callback with the directory, and you'll get also tools, like there's a tool automatically that gives you the path to the directory where your Java source is located, for instance. And you get a high-level object, and on that you could say, create me a new file in that package. So you could say that package in that file name, and it will create the package structure for you, it will create the file for you, and return it. So once you have the file, you can do whatever you like with it. Yes?
Will this talk be on YouTube or somewhere?
All talks at SpringOne are recorded, yes.
Okay, so they're on YouTube, I can do.
I don't know the timeline, but they are recorded, yes. Yes?
Why don't we provide an option to generate a concourse pipeline that we generate? Because that's such a common use case.
Yes, so why don't you generate a concourse pipeline with new projects? It's a very common use case. We get that quite a lot. We get that quite a lot on a number of topics. You have users that say, oh, why don't you generate a Jenkins pipeline? Other users, why don't you generate a concourse pipeline? We also have users that are basically asking us to offer an option to go YAML versus properties. So we have all those needs. The thing to remember for us with our mission of making sure it's a multi-client strategy is every time we add something, we need to make sure that the community will feel that as a sensible default, right? So the minute we feel that the community thinks it's a sensible default to go in that direction, there's a high chance that we will add it.
So then the next question, the last question, is if I had to contribute concourse pipeline in the project that you already described, is that a contributor to the, what is that API that I need to implement to
Very good question. So sorry, you're done? Yeah. Okay, sorry. So the question was, if I'm implementing that concourse pipeline generation, where should I put it? Is there a contribution model for it? So we've already had a few contributions in the generator API, even though StartupSpring.io does not use them, because those are really two different things. There's the library and the way we use it. And you could either keep it on your side. So there is no API basically for that. So you could, the way I would recommend is look at what we do for other assets. You could have like a pipeline model, for instance, that would describe what you want to express in that concourse pipeline. So that's basically an object that describes the options. And the other side of that would be a writer, so a concourse pipeline writer, where you give it a model and a writer, and it basically writes the file. Once you have those two pieces, that's what we use for the Maven model, right? Once you have those two pieces, you can basically instantiate the model yourself, customize it, pass it to the writer, and then it will write the file where you want. I'll take one more questions because there are people in the back, and otherwise you can come to me.
My question is, I think similar to his. I'm not familiar with concourse per se, but my big incentive for using something like this would be to create the build spec for AWS code. I gather that's more or less what you just talked about as well.
It's everything that's CI/CD related, yes. So the bottom line with this is the contract that we have in place in the API makes it possible to do it now. Yes.
You just don't want to own it on your end because there's so many permissions.
That's it. That's pretty much what I was trying to express. And the day we feel that the community is going in a direction, in a very specific direction, there's a high chance that it will be part of the library at that time. All right, thank you everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day.